Welcome everybody back to Propel. Sam Lee here, and this is the place where we look to bring you content that will encourage you, challenge and empower you to be the best that you can be, not only as a professional working within the aviation maintenance industry, but also as an individual. And today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Andy Evans from Aerossurance. And the topic, which I'm really excited and we're going to be discussing today, is when things go wrong, be careful what you're looking for. And I think this is a fantastic topic. So Andy, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me. Why don't you just spend a couple of minutes just introducing yourself?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Sam. My background many years ago was in aerospace design. And almost by accident, I ended up joining the Civil Aviation Authority in 1999, which was a really good time because it was at that point that a lot of the initiatives on maintenance human factors were starting to gain some traction as we headed to the first change in the aviation regulations to try and adopt this. So there's a lot of stuff going on when I was at CAA. And again, lucky enough, after 5 years there, to end up as the quality and safety manager in an air operator. And again, seeing these things mature over the next few years in industry. So it was a really fascinating time to see some of the early evolutions on maintenance human factors.
Excellent. And just because obviously I've looked at some of the stuff you're involved in, we've known each other for a while, but if you could sum up one thing you're really passionate about in terms of what you're passionate about communicating, what would that be?
I think it's the value of human factors, and that in terms of safety, and I'm looking at this as a sort of ex-safety manager, in terms of looking at the learning from investigations, that human factors is important, but not everything is human factors and human-centered. Sometimes there's a danger of safety investigations focusing on a human or a small number of humans and what they could or couldn't have done, doing that with the benefit of hindsight and missing the bigger sort of system issues and what the organization should be learning about those occurrences.
Yeah, brilliant. So that's what we're going to be looking at in a little bit today as well, isn't it?
Yeah, like what you've done by prompting me for this discussion is really think back to some of the incidents in those early days of my experience here of what things really I learnt from, and there were a couple of examples that stood out, and the first one was a case where an aircraft was towed outside in the morning. The flight crew went to do the walk around, and the pilot noticed that the little tip cap at the top of the vertical stabilizer was tilted over. So they queried it. They went out and had a look, and it had failed and clearly needed to be replaced. So the reason this one was interesting is the company involved was using a variant of the Boeing MEDA form, the maintenance error decision aid. And they went, we've had an occurrence. It wasn't found in maintenance. And they treated it as a maintenance error investigation, interviewed the maintainers, did a report and documented it. And they came to the conclusion that the daily check that the maintainers were doing didn't specifically point to this area and highlight this was a potential failure mode, and therefore they needed to put more in that check. And that's where the reporter got to at the point I first saw it. And that was sort of interesting. And being an ex-design engineer, and therefore quite interested in the hardware-y stuff as well, asked the questions about the tip cap. And so, well, why did it fail? You know, it's fine knowing that it was missed, but just why did it fail? And then a long saga came out that this particular aircraft had a concession in production. And quite bizarrely, when we looked at it, the concession was involved the bottom of this glass fibre tip cap. And in fact, it had been repaired below all the fastener holes.
Oh, wow.
And it had basically failed where it had been repaired.
Yep.
So actually, this was not a conventional failure in service. This was effectively a concession that probably shouldn't have been concessed.
Yep.
So it's a sort of production design liaison issue. And what this organisation had done by taking these actions to change the daily check was basically add yet another step to an inspection to look for a problem that was probably unique to one aircraft and was very unlikely to ever happen again.
Well, are you suggesting there then, Andy, that the investigation didn't exactly identify exactly what went wrong?
Yeah, well, they understood what had gone wrong, but because they were following a certain process, and because the process was based around a maintenance error decision aid, actually the reason it failed didn't feature very significantly in that process. There was a lot of discussion about how specific is the instructions to look for things, were people distracted, etc., and very little about how do you solve the hardware problem in the first place. And as you'll know from looking at tools like MEDA, it's a lot of ways that maintainers can fail, and a couple of small boxes where the manufacturers of aircraft, like the originators of MEDA, Boeing, got one little box on their documents, one little box on their hardware, and lots of ways that human factors can affect the maintenance. So it doesn't necessarily drive you to look at things in a holistic way. It certainly helps to get deeper into the human factors aspects where they're relevant, but you may, careful what you look for, if you look for certain things and not look at that big picture, you're going to miss stuff. And that was the big lesson out of that particular event for me.
So we can end up looking at an issue and doing maybe trying to find the probable root causes, but actually what's happening is we're kind of being led, if you like, down a certain line of questioning that makes us focus more on one area. And actually the danger there is that we might miss a whole load of other contributory factors. Is that what you're suggesting?
Exactly. And it is a bit of a theme in aviation, because aviation regulations drive organizations into these little silos. So you've got air operators and they have a camo, separate silo, and then you've got maintenance, a separate silo. 20, 30 years ago, some of those distinctions weren't there, but the regulations have driven us into more distinct buckets now. And then if you look inside those organizations, well, training is separate from quality, is separate from maintenance, and so on. And sometimes, we're only interested in our own little silo and we don't look further. And probably the second of these incidents is probably another good example of that. This was a case where there'd been some work done on an aircraft. Some pipe work was opened up, so valve was changed, but the aircraft needed to go for a ground run. And during the ground run, basically low pressure lights came on, chip lights then came on, repair work was now needed. And in doing the investigation, it was a far more conventional root cause of the problem. A non-return valve had been inverted. Now, there's two factors here. Of course, in one sense, isn't it a great pity that the non-return valve could fit in two completely different ways? The only defense turned out to be a small arrow on a sort of brass body, effectively, of this valve. So it was marked. And the investigation here was good. They worked out that actually in the bay, with typical lighting, it's really, really difficult to see against the background of the valve, even though it is physically marked. And the investigation came up with all sorts of ideas about perhaps every valve we have like this, we need to paint the arrow on in red to make it really distinct before we issue it to anyone, which is an arguably valuable initiative. But clearly, if you think beyond your silo, really, the best systemic fix is to change the valves. So there's different connectors on each end, so it can only go in one way. That's proper error proofing.
Yeah.
So that was all quite interesting, and the investigation was perfectly sensible on all of those things. But when I read it, the question I had was, so the low pressure light came on. Yes, it came on. So the ground run carried on with a low pressure warning light until the chip lights came on. Yes. So why was that? And the answer I got was a really good spotlight on this whole theme of looking at the wrong things or narrowing your investigation. And the answer was, well, that's flight operations. We're doing a maintenance error investigation. We can't look at that, can we? Now, there was then a brief argument where I suggested that the maintenance ground run was a carry forward task, and although it was being done by pilots, it's still sort of maintenance. The aircraft had not been released to service, so there's no reason not to look further. But again, it's a good example of people felt that, well, we're in our silo, we can't look over the edge at something that we think is elsewhere.
So are you suggesting then in this instance that the meter didn't work as well as probably what it was intended to work?
Yeah, well, again, you know, by using a tool that focuses on maintenance errors, they changed the wording later to be maintenance events.
Okay.
But by definition, the word maintenance is still in there.
Yeah.
And they're pilots. They're not maintenance engineers. That's something separate. The whole taxonomy and the whole focus started to draw people back into their silo, to put the blinkers on and ignore other things. It's valuable learning, and to just concentrate on, perhaps this is another challenge sometimes, is people only concentrate on things that they think they can influence being fixed or changed. So again, second investigation, you know, potential lessons almost, I'd say, deliberately ignored because they were felt to be out of scope, which I felt was a great disappointment. And for both of these, for me, what I learned was that emphasis on, you know, it's the event, the issue, the problem you need to look at, not looking at just a narrow silo, and also not focusing on, well, they're the people we're looking at. I think that's the other downside in bad investigations, in that people investigate the people, not the problem. And they make the people the subject of their investigation, not part of the investigation. They might not be part of the investigation team if you want to do things properly independently and stand back and look at the big picture. But if you use people as part of the learning, you're going to get a good result. If you use them as part of the problem to be investigated, and maybe we might clear them in the process of the investigation, you're setting up yourself for something that's far more defensive. And maybe you're not going to get the full picture.
I think that's really interesting, because if you go in with the expectation, like I've heard of people, in the maybe facilities I've worked in before, you hear that somebody, there's been this incident that's taken place, and then they go, oh, who was involved? Oh, okay, yeah, oh my words, yeah, terrible person, just needs to be fired. Actually, you go down that route, it automatically just narrows your focus, because you're thinking, you've got preconceived ideas, you've got pre-thought of assumptions that you're making based on maybe the reputation of an individual or something. And I suppose what you're suggesting is, we've got to be really careful not to narrow our perspective right from the outset of an investigation, because if we do that, we could so easily miss glaringly obvious stuff in the organization that might have contributed to setting somebody up to fail. So
and in fact, you've just reminded me of another really good example. This was many years later, and it's not a first-hand story. It's not even a third-hand story, it turns out, because what it was a conference presentation where the speaker was extolling the virtues of a particular just culture flowchart and how wonderful it was. And they came up with an example that it turns out, in questioning, they weren't actually involved in either. But it was a sort of lost tool incident, your classic lost tool event. But the story they told was how it was a sheet metal worker called in at the weekend doing a sheet metal repair. They'd gone home at the end of the shift. Monday morning, they'd come in and they'd realised they had a tool missing. It wasn't in their toolbox. And they told someone, which is really good. And the aircraft hadn't flown, which is really good, you might think. But the beginning of the story in the conference paper was the surprise of a pilot on this military aircraft as the tool had floated in front of them. And you go, so wait a minute. The tool was reported lost, but was found in the air. So for me, straight away, I'm interested in, so what happened after the tool loss was reported? And of course, that wasn't the subject of the presentation. The presentation was all about, well, we looked at this person and clearly they'd had the right intent and they had reported it. So in the end, we judged this to be an honest error, even though this guy was under investigation, their words, for a previous incident. Look, the wonders of the tool meant that actually we could see that the second case was definitely a blame-free event. And I'm going, yeah, that's great. But what happened after management were told the tool was missing? And this is your question in the conference. And the answer was, well, they did look, but they didn't find it. And because they'd looked thoroughly, they released the aircraft. But we had one person who'd worked on a Sunday on that aircraft who had a missing tool. Shouldn't we be looking at that whole process of responding to lost tools? And if anything, if you look at processes in an organization, losing tools is rare, but is far more common than losing a tool and then not finding it, I hope. Hopefully we find most tools when we lose them, or at very least, we really are sure they're not on the aircraft. Here, you were sure it wasn't on the aircraft and you were definitely wrong. Someone was definitely wrong. So where did that go? And the answer was, well, that wasn't looked at because it was an investigation into the lost tool. And again, it just shows how, that point you were making, if you focus in too soon and go, this is the problem we're looking at, all sorts of really more interesting things could get missed. And in fact, the whole presentation was, I felt, an exercise in showing we pick who we're going to try, and this guy was not guilty because we had a really good way of determining their guilt. Great. And you know, it's not really that effective, and just shows that I think there's still a lot of, we've got to decide if the guilt, it's a game of blame or no blame. We decide if there's blame, and that's what the purpose of an investigation is, to feed some facts to make that determination. And like the day job at Aerossurance is we spend most of our time working for customers that are contracting maintenance, contracting our operations. So we get to do a fun bit and go and visiting lots of organisations in the industry. And do you know, a lot of them still have processes where they do the investigation and then there's a review to see, is there blame or no blame? And perhaps people are still missing things, or perhaps are still putting the emphasis in the wrong direction. So, you know, I think there's opportunities there. You know, I think we're inadvertently sending the wrong message sometimes.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think we talk a lot about, you know, no blame or just culture and a fair process in investigating. But I think for individuals on the shop floor, mechanics and engineers on the shop floor, you know, when leaders or leadership talks about that from an organizational level, I think it does definitely vary from organization to organization, and really it has to be led from the top. I think just saying one thing is totally different to actually it being demonstrated by the leadership of an organization. And if it's demonstrated and it's led well, actually it can start to open up people to think, you know what, actually this is a safe environment for me to hold my hand up. And in fact, you know, one of the other conversations I've had with Scott Rexwinkle, who appears quite a bit on these YouTube videos, was about being able as an individual to put your hand up and say, I've messed up just here. I just want to let you know. I know it might be costly, but it's probably going to be less costly than some other incident happening because I've not told you about it. And actually what that can do within a safe environment is enhance the trust between that individual and their management or supervisors. So I think, you know, you're making some fantastic points about investigation. But one of the questions I want to ask you, because, you know, we've focused quite a lot on what we can miss when we're doing these investigations. So you're kind of making it sound a little bit like investigations are probably ineffective. I mean, what are you suggesting about
like they can be if you wear blinkers while doing them. That in one sense is no great revelation to anyone, but it's almost like sometimes investigations feel like they put on their own handcuffs to limit their abilities, or the investigation is limited in its ability, whether the people involved have a wider vision or not. And I think some of it is I'll say cultural, but I mean that in the way that you talked about just culture, but it's really weird that a lot of discussion about culture gets subverted into talking about just culture. That conversation itself is often a conversation about a just culture, procedure or policy, and things like flowcharts and how you apply it. And we've got to have policy and procedure to do it consistently. And you sort of say, well, what is it? And of course, the it is about, you know, blame or no blame. And I'm not arguing that that's not important and being inconsistent is better, clearly not. But in my mind, it sometimes feels like what we've decided is that rather than just look at something and understand how to improve, we're going to look at something and decide how to judge people really well. So it was almost like the lesson that was learned in creating some of these just culture policies and procedures and flowcharts was, let's try and make it like a court of law and make it really rigorous. And the irony is, if you look at a court of law, the judge does not pull out a flowchart to work out how guilty people are. You know, the courts don't work like that, but we've somehow created situation where, well, we don't have a court, of course, in aviation. No, no, no. We have an incident review panel, and that's made up of certain people who fit a criteria. And some people want them to be your peers, a bit like a jury.
Yeah.
And other people say, well, it's going to be disciplinary. So you need to have really senior people, because really senior people can look down on the whole organization, and maybe supervisors are complicit in things as well. So get someone senior on the panel. And in the end, you're just massaging a different legal system. And of course, you're in England, you have a mere and inefficient 12 people on juries in England. I'm in Scotland. We have 15, because you need 15 to do it properly. And that's almost the level of debate sometimes people have as they massage their review panel to get the right group of people. And, you know, are we really doing the full spectrum of culture? You know, often the bit about reporting culture is really just how many reports have we got?
Yeah.
You know, James reasons a little bit about, we've got just culture, we've got reporting culture, we've got a learning culture. Well, no one really talks about learning. You know, people have lots of charts to track the efficiency of their SMS, and they'll put up the bar charts to show the reporting. They might normalize it by flying hours of employees and track it trending over time. And we'll have the debate when we visit them to look at them on behalf of their customers, and they'll have the debate about, well, we're reporting hazards, and hazards are good and proactive, and they're going up, and our incidents, well, you know, really sophisticated people are breaking them down by risk and saying, well, we had a few high risk incidents, but we're getting lots of low risk ones. So people are reporting stuff, so that's good. And I then go, so tell me what you've learned. How do you track that? How do you track improving? And, you know, sometimes that becomes a little bit more embarrassing as actually the metrics aren't there. They're still looking at some of these, what you might say is still the early building blocks that maybe 20 years ago, read a track to show we're getting more occurrence reports and more hazard reports. And now we haven't moved on to show we've made positive change. This is how we know we have. You know, this, you know, you know, what I really like when I talk to people is they can say, this is the positive change we've made in the last month. This is what we're proud of. This is an improvement we put in place, as opposed to, look how our reporting rate has gone up. It's good, it's going up, but are you that's only a first order response. Are you really getting the deeper stuff and making a change? And I think that's still an area that we need to talk more of. An example, a certain well-known military aviation regulator has a manual of air safety. And there's quite a big percentage of that manual now is about culture. And that's great, because I think it moves it on from the more mechanical safety management system material onto something that is really more interesting about what an organization is and does. Unfortunately, 3/4 of that culture material is about just culture and deciding essentially, do we discipline people or not, and when do we do it consistently, as opposed to looking at how are we really learning, and how are we influencing things like that. And no one has a clue what Reason meant when he talked about a flexible culture, which was the fourth of his 4 factors in a culture. You know, and at best, there's a 5th one that was introduced after the Nimrod accident. Haddon Cave came up with the idea of a questioning culture. At least that is good, but it turns out not many people are questioning some of those original assumptions about, you know, what does a just culture really mean? How do we know that we're learning? So thanks for the opportunity to raise some of those question marks, hopefully.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I think, we could really split off into a number of different discussions here. And I think, culture, I've got a culture in my house. You come to visit my family, you could go away and go, oh, the culture there is like this. And you go and visit somebody else's family and think, oh, they've got a different culture. And a lot of it might be unwritten. It's what happens unwritten. So it's the way that people interact. It's the way that whether my children can ask questions or whether I'm a real, very strict disciplinarian. All that, I don't have to necessarily write that down, but then equally I could write that down and just pin up the rules on the on the kitchen fridge. But I think, culture is, as I think you were saying, it's more than just what's written down. And sometimes we probably focus very much on what's written down and think because we've got it written down, well, that's our just culture.
Yeah, and in fact, I think a lot of it is misconceptions. And, there was an early discussions about culture, and it talks about, people were talking about, well, a lot of it is like, you look for signs, almost literally signs. If you have a big sign that says safety is important, that's a cultural indicator.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it is. Maybe it's just an indicator that you like big signs. Having been on the opposite end of being audited by third parties, the classic types of findings that people would hand out back in the day were things like, we're concerned about the culture of your organisation because the safety policy is not signed by the accountable manager, it's signed by his predecessor. I had this pop up at one point in the past, and we had to go, indeed, the previous accountable manager left the company 3 weeks ago, and you're auditing a facility in deepest, darkest Africa, and it is correct, the safety policy still is signed by his predecessor. But we sort of made the point that we actually want the new accountable manager to think about the safety policy. And if they want to sign the same one, that's fine. If they want to change it, that's fine. But if the policy pops out 24 hours after they're appointed as some kind of things to do on day one, then they're probably not that committed to it.
Yeah.
And actually the workforce will probably realize they're not committed to it. I at the time was quite happy that we were going to take a few weeks. The world would not end. Again, it's one of those dodgy bits of learning. Yes, senior managers have a massive influence in the company. And yes, they can make things worse more easily than they can make things better, because the wrong word is more powerful sometimes than the right word. But actually, the thing with culture is, it is quite resilient in the sense that, and this is my view, people may argue with this, but sometimes a company led by a bad executive can sometimes carry on and ignore them for a bit, because they actually know what's right. I can think of one example of a company I've known for it's probably 22 years. I first visited it when I worked for the CIA, and I've seen them again for many reasons over the years. And there was a period of time when, their corporate structure was sending them in the wrong direction, and the workforce ignored them because they were more interested in safety, and they weren't going to be diverted by a bad initiative or a misguided management. Now that would have never survived forever, but people knew what was right in their opinion and were going to carry on doing it.
And that's
so
the individual
culture's quite interesting.
That's fascinating, actually, and I think that's a great point, because that's individuals' responsibility. Individuals going, you know what, for the sake of for the organization, for whatever reasons, for the moment, we're going to do what we know is right, and really supporting the leadership because they're doing what's right and trying to turn the ship, but from bottom up maybe. So I think individually we have got responsibility, but we've gone and touched on just culture, and I think that was great because that's very much effective investigations. And there's my dog. I need to stick up a list of things for him. One moment. This is the postman. Every time. Sorry, Andy.
I hope there's not going to be no incident investigation into bite injuries or anything like that.
She'll be fired. That's the quickest way to sort that out. I think she's.
It's all gone quiet.
It has, right. I'll lead in from. Yeah, so I think that was really great what we've just touched on about just culture and the fact that actually, we've all of us individually have got a part to play in that. But let's bring it back to investigations. And I know investigations can be very effective. So we've looked briefly at how they might not be effective and the things to be aware of. But just tell me about how we can make sure that investigations are effective if we're involved in them as an investigator.
Yeah. Well, you brought me back perfectly to the third of these early events that was quite influential on me because of the learning out of them, and this is in many ways different to the other two. So this was an event where there was some maintenance being done late at night. Pipe work had been removed. Time is ticking on. We need the aircraft in the morning, clearly.
I think many of us will be familiar with that sort of
stuff. But in this case, the team talked and went, nah, this is not the safe thing to do. They'd had the human factors training. This was all relatively new at the time. And they decided that the risk of fatigue was going to be such that they should come back to it in the morning and accept the aircraft wouldn't be available first thing.
Brilliant.
It's what they've been told to do in the training. So they came back the next morning, completed the job, and the aircraft needed a ground run, like my previous case, some similarities. The aircraft was taken outside, the ground run started, and hydraulic fluid was leaking everywhere. The aircraft was shut down, investigation triggered, reports were made, investigation triggered. And what was good about this was the investigator who was sent out was a well-experienced quality engineer, had done the training and did a really good job. The report came back and it was really helpful. And the important thing was it was done in a balanced way, because rather than go, as it turned out, why were these connectors left loose at the end of the shift? Because effectively they finger tightened the connectors so that no debris could get in there. But of course, when they revisited in the morning, they'd lost the recollection of where they got to, and it was assumed that the connectors had been torqued up, and they weren't, and they backed off during the ground run. So, again, there's classic maintenance error, human factors aspects here, and these were drawn out perfectly well in the investigation. But the key was the combination of a good investigation and the point in time it happened, because there was a new safety and quality manager in the organization, and there was a new technical director in the organization. Now, perhaps previously, management would have gone, tell me about who the guilty parties were, who made the errors. They'd have found out it was the team was being led by the shift supervisor. So it wasn't, out of sight from supervision. Supervision were directly involved in the whole task. And they could have gone, plan A, that shift supervisor is no longer a shift supervisor. Problem solved. And they'd have missed the big issue. And what was recognized by the management team is this was just a perfectly good example of not only the right things being done, but some of the wrong things. There was learning, but equally, one of those things that those, or most of those sort of just culture flowcharts don't do is go, so where did they do stuff well? Patrick Hudson had an attempt to try and solve this by having an expanded chart. He called it a FAIR system. It is completely unrelated to any trademarked tools, but his system asked questions like, well, where did people perform above and beyond? Where did they do what you expect them to do? And how do you, if an event occurs, how do you actually step back and reward people, for doing the right thing? James Reason, having written in sort of 1990 a book on human error, then went on into 1997 to write a book about organisational accidents. So as a psychologist, he'd evolved from trying to understand errors and to deconstruct them. Were they mistakes? Were they lapses? Into something where he looked and went, well, humans are working in a system. And in aviation, it's a very big system, a complicated system. How do you look beyond the human? Which is really quite novel for a psychologist, to turn around from looking at people to looking wider. And by the mid part of the last decade, he wrote a book on the human contribution, about how it's most of the time it's humans are stopping things being really bad because they're also your recovery mechanism. So all of these things are starting to remind us that it's not just how did people fail, it's how did they perform and what did they do well. And in this case, the management team looked and went, well, actually, they did what we hoped they would do, which is consider fatigue. It's unfortunate that as part of that end of shift bit, they didn't quite pick up on how do we defend ourselves from missing a step in the morning. But that's the lessons we need to learn. And these people have learnt that now. We've had a very expensive incident that they've drawn some learning out. How do we make sure everyone learns that? And the decision was made that actually, back to my earlier point, these people are part of the investigation rather than the subject. How can we make them part of the learning as well? So actually, rather than decide, do we blame people? Do we demote them? Is there ever disciplinary action? Do we need a note on their file? The discussion was all around, how do we get them to help us get the right continuation training that gets this message over? So that it's almost from the voice of people involved. This was the threat, and now we know this is how to defend, spot it and defend against it, rather than making a big exercise and then we failed and we now have to hang our heads in shame. It's like, how can the rest of us learn from it? And that turned out to be really powerful, because not only did it give us, in that case, much better feedback to the rest of the workforce, but probably more importantly, it sent a message that if you're involved, not only in an occurrence, but involved in solving it, it's a good thing. That's a positive contribution that you can be proud of, because you've helped everyone else learn. And that type of thing after that event was really powerful in that organization, in getting other people to come forward, be more confident. And we talked about occurrence reports earlier. We still have many technical failures, a fair few. They did, that silo did something that affected our silo. And we get the, I made an error, I did something, and we now realize it should have been done differently. But most of those cases are often, well, when they had no option. to
Yeah.
put a
Yeah.
report. The
Yeah.
number of reports were the classic things like independent inspections. The number of reports when independent inspection failed is quite small in the world.
Mm.
Now, do they fail? Probably a lot more than are reported. But what people do is they go, well, we can fix this. Now we know we can fix this. And now we fixed it. It's not a problem.
Mm.
So it's not really a report. So that's fine. We'll get on. Our job is to maintain things and get them back in service. And we have. So it's a success. Because we don't reward people for coming up with these lessons that other people need to know.
Yeah.
And the world sadly is full of major accidents where something similar happened before. In some cases they had an attempt to fix them, in other cases it just was never known about. And one of my passions is we don't live long enough to make all the errors ourselves, and one of the things I'm really frustrated by is the world, apologies, that's my computer now. The world is full of good lessons, but because people spend all their time chasing little lessons inside their own organization, sometimes they miss that someone else has had something happen to them. I was looking at one recently. It was a door that came loose and fell out an aircraft in flight. It's a bit of a known problem on that aircraft type. Does every maintenance organization dealing with that aircraft know about this? Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but there's an opportunity. So one of the little contributions Aerossurance hopefully makes to the industry is trying to drag out some of the more interesting case studies. So we spend a bit of time trying to find these foreign language accident reports that we can translate, as well as just the stuff that happens. It goes on an accident investigation website that maybe people just struggle to see in amongst the noise of all the things that get published. So,
and I like looking at accidents or investigations and reading the reports, watching the National Geographic accident investigation stuff, because actually as an individual in the industry, it makes me, I'd like to think it makes me more self-aware. It makes me think, rather than just focusing on what I'm doing and the task in hand, it makes me think a bit broader than that too. Well, how am I affected by the normal human factors, pressure, stress, fatigue, etc. And how is that affecting me? And like when I'm driving into work, I'll be thinking, okay, well, what's happened? What happened this morning? Well, I got up and fell out with my wife, maybe, and then jumped in the car, and that's playing on my mind. And now I know that I've got maybe a critical task or something to do at work. Actually, as an individual, I've got a responsibility to think, well, I need to be mindful of that and mindful about how it's going to potentially affect my decisions that I make today and my actions, and maybe the way that I interact and speak to those around me, because I'm feeling a bit short-tempered. And I think, just drawing this to kind of some kind of conclusion, we've talked about investigations, and you've mentioned a few examples of when they kind of could have done more to have a broader perspective for learning to take place, and for those organizations in the future to become even more effective, to reduce the error because they've learned a lot. Now, I just want to end on a couple of points, and I'm asking you these. For those people out there who are maintenance error investigators, or are really keen to kind of, pursue that line of work, what would you say really to help them to be good investigators? Maybe 2 or 3 just things that just come off the tip of your tongue to make them effective and avoid the pitfalls that you've mentioned.
Yeah, I think the key is gather the facts first. Don't analyze things too soon, and don't bound yourself too early. It's a common mistake to go, well, we'll look at what they've done during a shift, but we won't step back and ask what happened before that. Avoid the boundaries, gather facts, then start to analyze it with an eye on what are the improvements?
Yeah, brilliant.
And fundamentally, if you can't come up with good improvements, then things aren't going to happen. And avoid looking at people. You will talk to people, you'll think about what they did, but you've got to think about how can we improve as an organization, not how do we spend our time judging people. Because the number of times you'll find someone who first box on some of those charts was sabotaging the aircraft is really quite slim. And if you find sabotage, I'd call the police. At that point, you know, when people try and manage everything as some kind of safety investigation. And I think the second big thing is breaking the idea that the purpose of a safety investigation is potentially to gather things for a disciplinary hearing. Actually, if you ever get to the point where something like that's needed, you should do what the official part of the industry does. If the accident investigators find something that's really bad, the regulator has to go and do their own investigation, because you can't use the same thing. So separate it. And actually, the more you do that, the more people will be reluctant to waste time and spend effort rather to reinvestigate things. Actually, they'll realize that perhaps we need to do a bit less of that and to do a bit more on improvement.
Yeah, thanks to Andy. And then secondly, you know, the mechanics, the engineers who are watching this and thinking, well, you know, we've spoken a lot about investigators and the investigation process, but what part do I play? Maybe I'm in an organization where I know that some of the pitfalls you've talked about, I know that that's kind of how the investigations are carried out. I mean, what can I do firstly for myself in how I just do my day-to-day tasks to try to avoid error? And then secondly, how can I encourage, you know, when an investigation is taking place, are there questions I can ask to try and broaden the perspective of the investigators in that organization?
I certainly think if you're thinking about what do we need to do our job better, you can start to shift the spotlight into the right direction for the investigators if they haven't done that themselves. And I think the other thing is we've all got to look to try and find the learning generally when we see other people's investigations. Like the classic is you hear of an accident and you go, well, it wouldn't happen to us. And that's just saying we don't want to look for any learning. There might not be much. It might be really good, but there probably is something that either you're going to learn or you're going to relearn and re-emphasize. And there's plenty of things in life where you just got to remember that it could happen to us on a bad day. Yeah.
Now that's brilliant, Andy. Thank you. And I think I love that because it's all about, you know, we need to keep learning. I know that in the States, you know, when I did my AMP certificate, my examiner said to me at the end of the day, he said, Sam, this is a piece of paper to continue learning. You don't know it all. You are always going to be continually learning. Have that attitude, and you'll be setting yourself up to succeed. And I think I love that what you've just said. I think, you know, it's so important that as individuals, we're always looking to learn, even when we observe maybe it's an investigation that's kind of, we don't agree with the direction it's gone. You know, we can still as individuals learn from something from that. So Andy, that's been brilliant. Andy, I want to thank you for joining me today in what has been a fantastic topic that we've discussed. I know it's given the viewers a lot to think about. Just tell us very briefly how people can connect with you if they wish. I'm going to put your info into the bio just below this video, but is there any way people can connect?
Yeah, no problem. I go straight to the Aerossurance website, aerossurance.com. Our LinkedIn page is almost run as like an aviation news service. Yes. So we post our own case studies there, but more importantly, there's lots of other good stuff in the world. And hopefully, if we're interested, you might find some of it interesting. So that's the other big vehicle. So
brilliant. Thanks, Andy. And everybody who's watching, you know, thank you for watching this. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. If you haven't already, share the content And I encourage you to live with integrity in thought, word, and action, and do what you can to make a difference in your world. Be blessed, and remember your personal minimums. See you next time.